Hi, my name is Steve Bromage, Executive Director of Maine Historical Society. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Richard Kahn, who's going to help us provide some historical context in Maine for the current COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Kahn has been a physician in Maine for 50 years. For the past 30 years, he has been studying, annotating, and transcribing a fascinating manuscript in the Maine Historical Society collections. It's a manuscript book kept by Maine Dr. Jeremiah Barker from 1772 to 1820. The manuscript's going to be published by Oxford University Press this summer. This 2020 is, of course, Maine's bicentennial year, and it's a commemoration that largely has been put on hold to this point physically, but people are soldiering on online through programs like this. One of the fascinating things that Dr. Barker's manuscript does is really provide a glimpse and an insight into what Mainers were getting sick with in 1820 at the time of statehood and how they dealt with it. Richie, thank you so much for joining me.
Steve, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm always interested in talking about history of medicine.
Yeah.
I began my interest in history of medicine in medical school over 50 years ago. In fact, my chief resident said, "What are you going to do when you get old?" Well, I've been interested in history for the whole time I've been in practice. And whenever I'm researching a subject in history of medicine, I always try to bring in my beloved Maine. Sometimes it's difficult giving a talk on a 14th century manuscript, the Philobiblon. That's the first book printed on books on how to take care of them and what you do with them. And to bring in Maine was a little bit difficult, but I did it. That's another whole story. The staff of Maine Historical Society has always been helpful with my various projects over the past 40 years. And as Steve mentioned, the past 30 years, or 30 years ago, I was introduced to the Jeremiah Barker collection number 13. So that's what we'll be talking about in part today. But I just might mention that history of medicine, I'm an internist, I've recently retired, but I've always seen my patients, they're people. They're not a pneumonia in room 17. They're people, and they have interests, they have lives, and I've always enjoyed that so much. I'm just going to give you two quick examples. One is a woman in her, a man in his 80s, who I admitted about 1 a.m. when I was an intern at Maine Medical Center. This is years ago. And he had pneumonia, 103 fever, pneumonia by x-ray. He was stuporous. But the other thing he had, his bones were going in every which direction. I mean, I just couldn't figure out what was going on, but he was stuporous. I couldn't get a history from him. I started him on antibiotics, IV fluids, and when I came in for round 6 or 7 in the morning, I wasn't sure he'd be alive. Not only was he alive, he was sitting up and he says, "When am I going home, doc?" And we had a nice little talk, and I said, "Tell me about your bones." I was thinking during the night, what sort of exotic congenital bone disease did he have or anything like that? I said, "Now your bones are unusual in their shape and angles and everything." And he says, "Doc," he says, "I was a wing walker." He was a wing walker at state fairs, and with a biplane standing on the wing, and apparently they didn't always, or at least this fellow didn't always make it. So his fractures, many of them through the years, were set by him, by a neighbor, by somebody else, and that's why it wasn't any exotic bone disease. It was falling off wings of biplanes, which I hadn't really considered. Another example, I've always asked, I'm very careful about this, ask women, did you work outside your home? So this is a woman also in her 80s, a number of years, maybe 8-10 years ago. And I said, "Did you work outside the home?" And she said, "Yes, I worked for IBM." And I thought for a second how old she was and when she might have. I said, "Did you work in Endicott, New York, for IBM?" She said, "Yeah, how did you know that?" Well, I won't go into that. And I said, I thought for a second, I said, "Did you work on a Mark I and Mark II?" And she said, "Yes." And I was so excited to meet somebody. That's the first, like the early one of the earliest computers. It was at Harvard. It was 51 feet long. And I said, was it noisy? And she said, yes, because they had, before transistors, they had open and close circuits. So instead of a transistor, you had this gadget that opened and closed. So it made a racket, 51 feet of this computer. And to talk with someone who really worked on it, oh, you can imagine how excited I was. And she was excited that she's important, that she's an important, it's not, and I mean it, it wasn't putting it on, that it brings her life alive. And for me, it did. I just think
that's neat, Richie, because I think that gets to our spirit at MHS, which is every story matters, and every Mainer or person with a Maine connection, where they came from and what they've done is fascinating. So let's dive into the COVID story, and maybe we could take a couple minutes. And you just talked to me. You said something to me about the word epidemic and its meaning and its history that really helped me get my head around this kind of whole notion. We keep hearing about how is COVID-19 different than the regular flu, and you provided a little background on the word epidemic that really helped me understood why this is so different.
Okay, I mean, words are important. They're important for all of us. Some people are interested in words more than others. They read things like Lynn Truss's Eat, Shoots, and Leaves. They're interested in punctuation. Anyway, so words are important. So where does the word epidemic come from? What's its etymology? Epi, on, and demos is people. Latin and Greek, I think that it comes the people or the village. Now, an epidemic is an episodic, unpredictable, although you can predict that they're going to come sometime, but unpredictable exactly when, frightening and highly visible. It interferes with the normal function of society. A plague, yellow fever, influenza, Ebola, and COVID-19 are examples of this. Not diseases like tuberculosis, consumption, or malaria, heart disease, or cancer. They kill many people throughout the year. And nobody's happy about it, but it's something that goes along, that a certain number of people die each day, each month of heart disease. But as opposed to an epidemic, it's not altering and affecting the function of society as an epidemic does. Now, just a quick example, diphtheria in the 1730s in New England. It would come into some towns and half the children would die. Now that's an epidemic. I mean, that's a terrible epidemic, obviously. But the word epidemic is frequently used metaphorically or rhetorically to invoke a sense of urgency, to mobilize society. So you might hear somebody say, oh, we have an epidemic of cancer. Well, it's not an epidemic. There's a lot of it, but it's trying to get people to move, do something about it. And it's used in that way. Flu might kill 55,000 people a year, but it's spread out over months and months. It doesn't kill them in a month as this COVID-19. So if the regular influenza infects 1.3 people, when it happens 10 times, there's about 14 people sick. With COVID-19, if you infect each person infects 3 people, after 10, you're up to 59,000 people sick. That's what an epidemic does. And that's what I think we all need to understand, is exponential growth. We in this country have been unfortunate to avoid major epidemics since the flu epidemic in 1918-19, but they've always been around and part of life and death, going back to ancient times. Noah Webster in 1799 published a book, Brief History of Epidemic and Pestilential Disease. Yes, that's Noah Webster, the dictionary person. He was interested in counting. He was saying, if we're going to have a successful country, we can't have these terrible epidemics every summer, where I'll mention one of them, where anybody who can leaves town and the mortality is so high. We've got to do something about it. And this brief history of epidemic and pestilential disease, and another book he published a couple of years earlier, talks to those issues. One other issue, as language matters, Professor Alan Brandt, who's professor of history of medicine, history at Harvard, 2 weeks ago in the New England Journal, wrote an article referring to people using the term, this COVID-19 is a perfect storm. Well, he doesn't like that. He said, this isn't an anomaly. It's not unpredicted, although it's a virulent infection. And language is important because using the term perfect storm may undermine our ability to address the issues. If we say it's a perfect storm, this happens every so often, there's nothing we can do about it, it may really alter how we deal with it. Susan Sontag and illness as metaphor and AIDS as metaphor, and the Maine Historical Society was involved with the Maine Humanities Council in the early 80s doing a program on the humanities and AIDS, and she took part in it. So this is really what we need to do, is to have a strong public health infrastructure, research, surveillance, and public education. We're living as part of a worldwide, complex worldwide ecosystem, and we have to deal with these epidemics or pandemics as in a mutually respectful way. That we can't be name calling and doing some of the things that are happening. We should be able to do better than this.
So Richie, I want to dive in. I want to kind of come back to the arcs of how society and these pandemics play out over time and in different time periods. But first, let's get a little grounded and tell us a little bit about Dr. Barker, the Maine doctor, Dr. Barker, and what he was doing traveling around Maine, capturing and documenting disease and cures around the time of statehood. What was it like to get sick then? And who was this guy and what was he trying to do?
Dr. Jeremiah Barker was born in Situate, Massachusetts in 1752. He was taught by the congregational minister, Reverend Mr. Cutter, and then he had a preceptorship, 1769 to 72. That was his medical education. Keep in mind that, in those, at least 95% of people lived in rural areas. Now it's vice versa. And many didn't have physicians, or the physicians just said, I'm a physician. You didn't have to, there's no boards or anything you had to do. So you did not go to college, did not go to medical school, but that was the rule rather than the exception. There were no medical schools in New England, by the way, at that time. There were only 2 medical schools in the United States. Pennsylvania, Medical College of Pennsylvania, Medical School of Pennsylvania, became University of Pennsylvania later, and King's College in New York after the Revolution, Columbia. So that was his training. So he finished in 1772, and he came up to Maine just for there was an epidemic in Nobleboro. I won't go into details, but it's sort of an interesting thing. And in fact, although he doesn't mention it in a letter, there was a bad flu epidemic that year, according to Noah Webster. So he stayed there for a year, and then Massachusetts. In fact, in 1772, it wasn't even called a district of Maine. It was the eastern part of Massachusetts. So he practiced in Barnstable until 1779, at which time he took part in the Bagaduce or Penobscot expedition. William Berry, who was at the Maine Historical Society, The Wild World of New England, or I can't remember the exact title, but he says this was the worst defeat of an American Navy until Pearl Harbor. So that was I won't go into that in detail, but he was on the Penobscot expedition, saved some medicines, he writes, from the burning deck, and it helped him get started. He moved to Gorham in 1780, and he stayed in Gorham and Stroudwater, Portland, until he retired in 1818 and died in 1835. He began writing the book that's going to be published certainly by 1797. So he went around and he made house calls, and he said, he described one flu epidemic, for example, for 3 months, he never got home. He would just make house call. He would either sleep there or sleep however he slept. And he was so busy, he just couldn't get home. That's the sort of life he had. And he describes in his manuscript various epidemics, what they tried to do with philosophy. I'll deal with that in a little while.
Yeah.
So that's
so
what I wanted to say.
So what was the nature of what was a patient's interaction with the doctor at that point in time, and how is that different than from today? When are you calling the doctor and when are you not? And what is he able to do for you?
Well, the doctor, um, there's several things that that happen with an interaction. Do people call the doctor immediately these days? Well, probably faster than they did in the past. First of all, there weren't many doctors around. There was also a skepticism, as there's among some people today, skepticism and its costs. And they were issues then. So what the first thing, there would be somebody usually in the family, usually it'd be a mother, a grandmother, or a neighbor who was interested, and they'd be the first to advise what to do. There were books, recipe books, domestic medicine books that they might look at, and only if there was a severe disease or it didn't respond to what they were trying would a physician be called. Anyway, I think that's pretty much that's it.
Okay.
You know, I mean,
and so, what were the kind of things that Mainers were getting sick of in 1820? Are they common things that we have today, and we just have cures, or are they different?
well, there are some things the same. There was, and some things are different. Trauma is a problem today, although they didn't have many automobile accidents 200 years ago. But not as many people probably, although Maine may be a little different. The man who built our house when we lived in Union died taking a cold and an axe wound. So trauma, all the outdoor sort of things, fractures. People fell then and fall today. So those were common. Leading killer of children was GI diseases, diarrheal disease. So if you go to a cemetery, you'll see age 2, age 3 months, age 6 months. They didn't have refrigeration. Food may have spoiled. The sewage, if the septic was near the water, that would do it. They didn't realize that. Some of the bronchitis was a common problem then, and it's a common problem today. The difference, I think, might be there'd be more people that would go on with bronchitis to get pneumonia that would go on for weeks, months, with something nowadays that may be treatable. Not talking about the beginning bronchitis, having the first week or two, but going on, coughing, fever, coughing up blood and other material. It would just go on and on. So consumption was the leading cause. And for example, the first US census that include cause of death list in Maine lists consumption as by far the leading cause of death. What is consumption? Consumption comes from the Latin consume. The body sort of, you lose appetite, you lose weight, you shrink up in case of pulmonary lung consumption, tuberculosis, frequently but not always coughing up blood, fever, and you waste away. And that was consumption. Did everybody have tuberculosis? No. And by the way, tuberculosis wasn't used as a term till the mid-19th century. So before that, it was phthisis or consumption. So in there would be some patients with cancer, so some other diseases, but that was the I mean, one of the things you have to be careful about is retrospective diagnosis. How they describe things may be different the way we describe things, and if they give it a name, it may or may not be the same as a name that we would apply to it.
Yeah. So Richie, talk to me a little bit about how medicine has changed since that period. One of the things that strikes me about the current pandemic is how long it's been historically since we've really had a pandemic like this, that an infectious disease that's threatened many of us. You know, you go back, there's a lot of references to the Spanish flu epidemic in 1918. Polio was something that had a devastating impact up into the 1950s. We had the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. But it seems like one of the reasons we feel vulnerable or to have such a hard time dealing with this is that we haven't been personally threatened by communicable diseases in, you know, the wealthy, quote unquote, United States in a long time. So what's been the evolution of our understanding of disease and our ability to treat things through vaccines and otherwise since then?
Well, you go back before the 19th century, going back several millennia, people were, Helen Binham, a historian of medicine, said there were diseased individuals rather than diseases. They may not have had a name, but people were sick. And it was a combination, the balances, they felt the humors were out of sync. It had to do with the weather. It had to do with miasms, the air, in fact, the word malaria means mal air, bad air. They thought that it was the bad air coming from the marshes. It didn't realize at the time that it was the mosquitoes that were on that air that were carrying it. But so until Barker's time, that's pretty much how they thought of it. When Barker started practicing, it was just the beginning. We started what we might call modern medicine. Developments in physiology, pathology, chemistry, and then in the mid to late 19th century, again, this is after Barker, bacteria were found to cause disease. Louis Pasteur's work, Lister in antisepsis and asepsis surgery, and Robert Koch in 1882 found that tuberculosis is caused by an organism called Mycobacterium tuberculosis. You could put it in a lab animal, you could study it, and you can transmit it to someone else. And that was a specific cause, and that was a change. If in Barker's time, if you said this has a specific cause, you would be called a quack, because they were thinking more in terms of the whole body. And Barker was writing about Maine. He was writing about northern New England, because what he had to read, and he contributed to the medical literature, what he had to read was from certainly South Boston, but Philadelphia more so, the South United States, but even more so, Paris, London, and they had their disease, the frequency of disease were quite different than what you might have in Jefferson, Maine, or Union, Maine. So again, the specific
Richie,
causes rather than the human.
You had shared a great quote with me about the Maine climate and environment versus the southern colonies that I thought was really great, that really pointed to one of the things we love about Maine so much is climate, even if we have long winters. Can you share that with me?
Well, I don't have that right in front of me, but basically what James Sullivan, who was governor of Maine, I think it was 1807, 1808, he was from Berwick, Maine, and what he said, something like the people in Maine might complain on a cold winter with the snow out, gee, wouldn't it be nice to be in the Carolinas or Virginia? But they wouldn't want to be there with the ague and fevers that they had. So he knew, and so did I, that there were diseases, this is within the United States, that they were different, that we didn't have malaria. And yellow fever was not a real issue in Maine, although there were some people who were diagnosed yellow fever, but it wasn't the mosquitoes that carry yellow fever would freeze their butts off in Maine. So
we were protected, another Main characteristic. Okay, so
yes.
Fast forward me to the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918. That's also been referenced a lot. So can you tell us a little bit about the dynamics of that and why it had such a huge impact globally and in the United States and in Maine, and what that tells us about COVID-19 or not?
Well, the flu epidemic in 1918 took off rather rapidly, or there was several bumps. It would slow down a little bit and then peak again. There was the second peak, I think, was the greatest. And this was all over the world, and certainly in the United States. They did things that we're trying to do. For example, the governor closed, you couldn't go to theaters. They had issues with churches. In the pandemic, they tried to not to close all the churches. Well, several of the churches said, you can't tell us to do that. That sounds familiar. But trying to do that to prevent the spread of the disease. But it killed a large number of people, and there were very few families that had no either member or dear friend that weren't affected. One of the differences with the flu epidemic of the, if you want to call it Spanish, I don't like doing that. That, you know, if you give it a name like that, it's sort of like the English called syphilis the French disease, and the French called syphilis the English disease. You know, we can just name call, but I don't think they had a nomenclature similar. But it affected. It wasn't only elderly, debilitated people. There were people like 14, 16-year-old healthy kids who would become sick, and 2 days later they were dead. This is before ventilators or any of those things, but it behaved different than the usual epidemic of influenza. And that's what this COVID-19 is also, you know, behaving different than a lot of other than, for example, the 1918 flu. But it affected society. And I'm not even sure as much this is affecting society. But the issue of scapegoating, you know, and that's been there since, for example, in the 1790s, yellow fever epidemics in this country. I mentioned Webster, but there were other people. If we're going to have a successful country, we can't have the country closing down. In 1793 in Philadelphia, yellow fever attacked. There were 50,000 people living in Philadelphia. Anybody with money or could get out of town. So 20,000 people left town, and of the 30,000 left, 5,000 died. You know, that's a lot of people. Yeah. You know, and there in Barker, there are several cases of somebody, a seaman, for example, from Portland, who came up from Philadelphia with a fever, and went to his home in somewhere in the Portland area. There were 9 people in the family, 6 died within the next month or two of what sounds like yellow fever. But in a major book, 1909, Augustine's tome on yellow fever, it said there were 3 reports of yellow fever in Maine, but none of them disseminated. So there was no epidemic in Maine. This was a person. And I sent, by the way, that one case I sent to Randall Packard, is professor of history of medicine at Hopkins, and also another a maven of dengue and world medicine. I sent him the case, and he thought it sounds like yellow fever to him. We don't have any other evidence, but that was it.
So Richie, fast forward me to the 1950s and the polio vaccine. It seems to me, you know, as a kid who grew up in the 60s, you know, again, we haven't, because I'm presuming because of vaccines and such, you know, we have not had this kind of widespread outbreak. So can you talk a little bit, was that such a significant moment, the 50s with the vaccine, you know, in terms of what the United States was experiences in terms of infectious diseases? What turned?
I think it was, but it wasn't, it didn't affect society the way this is, and the way the flu epidemic in 1970. I think it affected our parents more than it did us. They were so worried about us children getting it. Polio, I'm not sure I mentioned, but there was an epidemic in 1916 of polio, 1916. And I was looking through the Courier Gazette, and I think it was September 1916. And there were several cases in Rockland, Maine. And in the papers, there were not reports, but notices from Camden Rockport, the Board of Health in Camden Rockport, and from Thomaston, basically saying, if you're a rag picker, junk dealer, or fruit vendor, don't come to our towns. Who are those people? They tend to be immigrants. Yeah. They tend to be, those are jobs that are, and actually, and I wondered, is that, you know, local xenophobia? Is that a local Maine issue? It wasn't. When I checked it out, New York, other places were doing the same sort of thing. In retrospect, retrospect, they were probably less likely to be transmitting polio than the bank president, the head of the various organizations, because they would more likely have had it as children.
Okay.
But that's what they thought, and the xenophobia was an issue then.
Which grows out of fear. I think, fear is such an important part of this. You talk about the parents and polio, and how do we protect ourselves? How do we operate? So you see these common human kind of reactions, as it were. So kind of you've spent a lot of time, and you have quite a grasp of the sweep of history and people history and medical history. What stands out to you about COVID-19, this moment we're in now, and how it's going to maybe impact us long term?
There's a couple of things. First of all, certainty is unattainable in medicine. That's something we all have to. It's the best guess, and what we want, the best guess of people who have the most information in front of them to make an educated guess. Is it going, when they say, I think it's okay to go back, that doesn't mean it's there. They think it's reasonably safe. And there's going to be, and is, a sort of balance going back and forth. Is it politics, or is it, is it medicine, death, worrying? And whoever makes that decision, it's a toughie if you care. I mean, I can think and I think it was 1976, there was an epidemic of influenza that was similar to the one in 1918, molecularly, genetically and everything. And they had to make a decision. David Sencer was head of CDC then. And do we try to make a vaccine because this could be a terrible epidemic like what we're having now? Or do we just, maybe it won't be bad? Well, it ended up, their decision was to make a vaccine. It ended up that there was not an epidemic, and a few hundred people got Guillain-Barré, got a disease from the vaccine. So, oh, what a terrible decision. Aren't they terrible? Well, I don't know. If I had to make that decision, oh, darn, we could have made a vaccine, but we didn't, and 20 million people died. I mean, that's the other side of that coin.
Right. Yeah.
And I might just mention, I mentioned about, self-care. You had asked me before about how did Mainers cope. They had recipe books, I mentioned, domestic medicine books, and then healer midwives. And many of you have probably read Laurel Thatcher Ulrich's The Martha Ballard Diary, A Midwife's Tale. If you haven't, you should read it. But she took care of a number of people. And doctors were, as I say, usually consulted just if there was severe disease or their treatment failed. And I think I mentioned skepticism. And there was an issue then. There was skepticism. And it was beginning to be, in the early 19th century, beginning to be skepticism. They were being better. They were starting to get into, I don't know if statistics is the right word, but measuring, counting. Not Pasteur, Pierre-Louis in Paris, and a number of people were starting, we should be measuring, we should be counting and see if what we're doing, is it right? How we're diagnosing things. Very careful observation and conclusions.
Yeah. Well, Richie, I really appreciate you taking some time to share this perspective with us. It's fascinating. Dr. Barker's manuscript will be available this summer. It's a fascinating look and glimpse into Maine and Maine history. I have to point out, there's a lot going on in the internet with evaluating people's background cases as they're Zooming. And I'm aware that there's all kinds of gems sitting there behind Richie, including bloodletting devices and other kind of neat medical equipment, shall we say. Maybe another day we'll have a tour of that. Yeah, and I want to thank you for joining us for being part of this conversation. If you have any questions, feel free to email them, shoot them to us, and we'll get an answer back out to you. Take care of yourselves. Be well. Richie, thanks again. Any final words?
Steve, can I say one more? May I say one more thing?
Yeah.
Predicting history, is difficult. And for example, George Hegel, a contemporary of Barker, said the owl of Minerva spreads its wings only in the falling of the dusk. In other words, at the end, when you look back, you can see, was this really historical? Did we do the right thing? And I hope this whole episode will teach us the importance of relying on science, not politics, in future epidemics. Thanks, Steve.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great point, Richie, and it just reminds us again that, you know, the value of history and informing. It's not a roadmap, but by understanding how things happen and how we have responded in the past, really not just in medicine and not just in epidemics, but when we're thinking about the economy and social issues, it really equips us with perspectives on how things work and how we can make them work better, or how we would like them to more closely in the future. So thank you very much, and thank you all to joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again real soon. Thank you.